Hi everyone. This week I want to turn away from Turkey and move on to a new country in the Middle East, the country of Iraq, and I want to think about the issue of patriarchy in terms of Iraq and the way in which patriarchal systems tend to undermine efforts to create more democratic societies. I'm going to start with the discussion, as I always do, of several important thinkers who discuss this issue. I do this, like I've said before, not because I'm going to be testing you on it necessarily, but because I want to give you a sense of the discussions that are underway about this topic and the diversity of ideas. I want you to have some of those ideas in your mind as you're doing your reading and as you're listening to me talk for the rest of the lecture. Issues of patriarchy are not particular to Iraq or to the Middle East. They're much more broad than that. And so I want us to appreciate this idea outside of the particular examples we're looking at today in Iraq. After that, I'm going to give you a brief history of Iraq, very brief. It should supplement what you're reading either before you've listened to this lecture or after in the textbook. I just want to give you a general sense of some of the names and important dates before I then jump into a few specific examples of how patriarchy was either reconstructed, reformed, challenged during different periods of Iraqi history. And finally, I want to wrap up by discussing how gender and democracy can relate to each other. The reason I want to talk about patriarchy this week is because it's a topic much like nationalism or much like the state or much like many of the other topics we'll be discussing during this class, which is often brought up and pointed to as a reason why the Middle East is not democratic. Often people will say, well, democracy has trouble flourishing in the Middle East because it's a patriarchal society, or because there's religious sectarian divisions, like we'll discuss next week, or because there's these competing nationalisms and that undermines democracy. I don't disagree with those sort of assessments, but I think it's important to realize that all these topics can be found in any society and in any country. Patriarchy is a particularly good example of this because some of the early thinkers, especially the ones I'm going to give you an example of, were not talking about the Middle East, right? They were talking about America or England. For example, Juliet Mitchell was a feminist scholar of the 1960s and 70s in particular. She argued that patriarchy is the omnipresent system of male domination and female subjugation, achieved through socializing, perpetuated through ideological means, and maintained by institutional methods. So what she's saying is male domination over women, over families, patriarchy, is not a natural thing. It's created, right? It's created by socialization, so it's taught to people in schools, it's inculcated in children. It's perpetuated through ideological means, so our movies, our TV, our books, what our teachers say to us in class, what our parents tell us is true or not true, all these types of things, they all add up to create a sense that patriarchy is a real and natural thing. And it's maintained through institutional means. So this can mean laws, this can mean structures of government, this can mean brute force when necessary. I think this is a very good definition to think about, right? And to take it a step further, what she's arguing is that there's no reason that men should be dominant in society over women. The reason this is because of the ideology associated, the ideas associated with men and women. And this is where the larger concept of gender comes in, right? Because a society's understandings of gender help sustain the dominance of men over women. Because if your idea is that certain things like leadership, like authority, like action are inherently manly, and some things such as being in the home, dealing with children, being passive, if those things are feminine, those ideas of gender help create the actual structure of power in which men are powerful over women. So we go from an issue of simply men and women to one of gender, right? And that's where some of these other scholars come in. Joan Scott, for example, is a historian, and she talked about gender is a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between the sexes, and gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power. That's similar to what I was just saying to you, right? That it's not just about men and women, it's a way how men and women understand their relationships to one another. And it's a way of creating power relationships between men and women that are not inherent or natural. As a historian, Scott argues that we need to tell the stories of how these different ideas of gender developed and how these different relationships of power were created. Denis Candioti is a political scientist who focuses on development economics. And as you saw, if you read her article yet for this week, what she thinks about is she calls them patriarchal bargains, gender pacts. And what she's arguing is that the relationship, the power dynamic between men and women, is premised on bargaining and exchange. And under certain circumstances, these pacts, these bargains, can be renegotiated, right? Sometimes in women's favor, sometimes not. And what we have to be looking at is not necessarily the history and the long scale of how things came to be the way they are, but we can look at particular moments, and you might want to do this in your papers. Look at particular moments where these pacts and these bargains are suddenly being renegotiated and why that's happening and how it turns out. And then finally, I want to bring us back to two scholars who I mentioned last week, Neera Yuval Davis and Flora Anthias. And I like them simply because they give us a nice set of ways of thinking about gender in society and, to the topic of this week, how women's roles or the roles allowed or prescribed for women in a society help reinforce a patriarchal system in which men are dominant. So they argue that nationalist movements are gendered, with women in roles of reproducers, signifiers, and participants, but not definers. So as I pointed out last week, in, say, the Kurdish national movement or the Turkish national movement, there's an idea that women should have roles that contribute to that movement, right? Men are dominant, men are creating the ideas, but women have roles to play. What are those roles? We can ask ourselves that. This week, what I want to talk about is how these ideas of patriarchy, so these ideas of male dominance, helped reinforce different undemocratic regimes in Iraq during the past 100 years. In order to do that, I'm going to take the next several minutes and give you a very quick political names and dates history of modern Iraq. Now, let's return to a map that I showed you on the first day of class. This is a map of the Ottoman provinces that have now, over the past 100 years, become the states of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and also a little bit of Saudi Arabia, and also Israel, Palestine. So, Iraq is composed of the provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. Basra is, if we're going to generalize, majority Shia Muslim. Baghdad has more Sunnis, but it's mixed. And Mosul has a large number of Kurdish-speaking people, also Turkmen tribes, so people who speak a Turkish language but are more nomadic. And other groups as well, Assyrian Christians, Yazidis, who are not Muslim, they have their own particular religion, so a very mixed province. The point I want to emphasize is not that these three provinces are so different that it would be impossible to form a political community out of them, but rather that there is differences between them. There's historical differences, there's linguistic, there's cultural differences, and so those things have to at least be kept in mind when we're talking about Iraq even today. During the course of World War I, these provinces were occupied by the British. During the war, the British received assistance from Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi, who was the Sharif of Mecca. In other words, he was the Ottoman-appointed local official in Mecca and Medina, the two most important religious cities in the Muslim world. And as his last name indicates, al-Hashimi, he claimed ancestral connection to the family of Muhammad. So he had a lot of claims on loyalty in the Muslim world. At least that's what the British hoped, that's what the British thought. In fact, the practical weakness of this man and his descendants has been a constant feature of Middle Eastern politics. In his case, by 1924, pretty soon after World War I was over, he was kicked out of his territories by his rivals in the Arabian Peninsula, the Saudis, who went on to create Saudi Arabia as we have it today. During the war, however, he provided valuable assistance to the British. His sons, Faisal and Abdullah, led Arab fighters against the Ottomans, and Faisal was even able to take control of the city of Damascus in modern-day Syria at the end of World War I. What the Hashemite family didn't realize, however, was that the British and the French had already made a deal during the course of World War I in which cities like Damascus were going to become part of the French post-war order, and places like Baghdad were going to become part of the British post-war order. Faisal and his fighters resisted French attempts to take Damascus. However, they were defeated by the French at the Battle of Maysalun, and Faisal had to leave Damascus. With Faisal gone, the French were able to focus on developing their control of Syria and Lebanon. The British, meanwhile, began to focus on developing their control of Iraq and Palestine and Egypt. There are two reasons that the British wanted to control these territories. First is that after World War I, the British still controlled India. So the British wanted a continuous set of land that would allow them to connect England with India via the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and on to India. That's one reason. The second reason was starting to be oil. During World War I, Britain was converting its navy over to oil, and they wanted to have access to oil fields, not necessarily in, say, Iraq this early, but in Persia, what would become Iran, and Azerbaijan, what's now Azerbaijan. These were the areas where there was a lot of oil in the region, and by controlling these areas you see on the map, the English could build pipelines in order to get oil from those areas to the coast, and from the coast to the Mediterranean, and from the Mediterranean to England and to its fleet, which was based in places like Cyprus and Egypt. What the British wanted after World War I, therefore, was stability. They wanted to put in place local figures who could maintain stability and allow for British interests to go forward. From the British perspective, this was difficult in Iraq because Iraq was so diverse. There were Sunnis, there were Shias, there was Kurds, there was Turkmen, other groups as well. And so which of these groups' representatives was the British going to put in charge of all of these groups? Well, what the British decided to do instead was to appoint an outside figure to rule over this area. So the British put Faisal in charge of Iraq. They put his brother Abdullah in charge of what's now the country of Jordan. But during the 1920s, Faisal was the British official overseeing the mandate of Iraq. By the early 1930s, the British negotiated with him and made him king of Iraq. Iraq became an independent country. The only condition was that Faisal signed off on a series of treaties that gave the British the ability to send in their armies when they needed to, transport things through Iraq. In effect, the British achieved all the things they wanted without actually having to have responsibility for what was going on in Iraq. The responsibility was with the Hashemite family of Faisal, and then after Faisal died, King Ghazi. Now, if you'll notice, Faisal died early in the 30s, Ghazi died by late 30s, and when Ghazi died, there was no one old enough to take his place. As a result, this guy became king of Iraq, and during the 1940s, Iraq was a fairly weak state with different military factions fighting for control. The British reinvaded in the 1940s in order to maintain British interests during the course of World War II. As you can see from these dates, Faisal II didn't even become 18 until the early 50s, and so even during the 50s, the king was still fairly weak, and his advisors and his uncle and people around him were far more important in developing policy. In 1958, however, all this came to an end. The king and his family were all killed in a military coup. There had been previous military interventions into Iraqi politics, but typically the military had asserted itself and then ruled with the king as a figurehead. No more. Now the monarchy was dead, a republic was declared. Without getting into too many details, suffice it to say that this leader, Abdul Karim Qasim, during his time as ruler of Iraq in the late 50s, early 60s, he tried to implement a lot of social reforms, land reform, a new law, which we'll come back to, which dealt with the laws relating to family life. And he also tried to balance between communists, socialists, nationalists, and other political parties, and also various ethnic rivalries between Sunnis, Shia, Kurds, Turkmen. And beginning with the 1958 revolution, Iraq experienced 15, 20 years of very tumultuous politics. Qasim himself was overthrown and killed in a coup in 1963 by this other man I have pictured, Abdul Salam Arif. And Arif died in a plane crash a few years later, and his brother took over, and his brother then was also overthrown in a coup. So you see, the 1960s were a very confusing time. And that's why I don't expect all these names and dates in and of themselves to matter. What matters more is the chaos of the 1960s. This chaos explains the desire for stability that many Iraqi people felt during the late 60s and early 70s. And in 1968, Arif's brother was overthrown and a new regime was established, and this regime lasted for much longer. This was the Ba'ath Party regime. Ba'ath is the short way of saying the Arab Socialist Renaissance Party. Ba'ath means renaissance or renewal in Arabic. And the Ba'ath Party was established in the 40s and became very popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was socialist not in like a left-wing sense that there were classes that were struggling against one another, but it was socialist in the sense that its leaders thought the state should have a lot of power to control the economy in order to provide for the common good. So it had a lot of nationalist policies, but also nationalization of the economy policies. And it was actually very anti-leftist. It didn't like communists because it thought they were trying to pit different classes in society against one another. So people who were in the Ba'ath tended to be nationalists. They believed in a unified society where differences were subordinated to a common identity, and they believed in a strong state that could provide for the general social welfare. The Ba'ath Party was popular across the Arabic-speaking world, but especially in Iraq and in Syria. The government of Syria today is actually a Ba'ath Party government as well. In Iraq, the Ba'ath Party came to power briefly in the early 60s and then again more firmly, as I said, in 1968. The Ba'ath Party was very hierarchical. It was imagined as having membership at the local level, the national level, and even the supranational, pan-Arab level. And that's why the Iraqi party isn't the Ba'ath Party, it's the Iraqi Regional Ba'ath Party. There's imagined to be an even larger entity which it was subordinate to. The important thing to understand, though, is that the Ba'ath Party was very hierarchical, very bureaucratic, and especially in its early years as it was taking shape and establishing itself, there was a lot of infighting within the different groups and different power centers within the party. The official leader, the president of Iraq, was Hassan al-Bakr during the early 60s and into the late 70s. But the real power behind the throne, as it were, was al-Bakr's relative, Saddam Hussein. Hussein spent much of the late 60s and early 70s consolidating his power over the Ba'ath Party, over the Iraqi state, over the intelligence services, and so on and so forth. By the late 70s, he was ready to take full control of the party and the state. In the late 70s, al-Bakr retired, and Saddam Hussein became president, so all the power was now consolidated in his hands. And he ran Iraq from the late 70s until 2003, when the U.S. invaded. He was the longest ruling figure in the Middle East by the end of his time in power. Three things, I think, account for the longevity of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party. The first is the fact that there was such instability before the Ba'ath Party came to power in the late 50s and 60s that people liked the stability the party brought. The second important reason is oil revenue. As we can see from this chart, during the 1970s, oil production rose to levels that have not been achieved again until recent years. Also during the 70s, oil prices were rising, so those two rises during the 70s mean that a huge amount of money was pouring into Iraq. The Ba'ath government used this to build schools, build hospitals, provide more social services, but it also used a lot of this revenue to develop its army, and Iraq had one of the largest armies in the world by the late 70s. And on this graph, we can see a gigantic drop in production in 1980. That's because in 1980, Iraq launched a war against Iran. And this war devastated the Iraqi economy, especially in those first years. You see the decline in oil production. And that oil production then increased again up until about 89, 90, 91, when again it drops precipitously because the Iraqi government decided to invade the country of Kuwait, which led the US and its allies to attack Iraq, kick Iraq out of Kuwait, and impose sanctions. And you can see on this graph from 1991 until 1997, these sanctions were very strict. After that, production started to ramp up again, not ever to its previous rates, but to a good degree until 2003, when again the US invasion of Iraq again crippled production and hurt the economy. So what we see from this is that during the early years of Saddam Hussein's time in power, the early years of the Ba'ath Party rule, there was money coming in, it was being used for social services that helped make the regime strong. Why did the regime stay in power even after these incredible drops in production, after decades of war? I think that's on account of the third reason we can point to, which is the security apparatus that was created under Saddam Hussein, making it very hard to resist his rule. The Ba'ath Party spread into every aspect of people's daily lives and became so dominant that people were unable to challenge the government even if they wanted to. US leaders talked about the Ba'ath Party as though it was a totalitarian party and Iraq was under a totalitarian regime. So, after the US invaded and after the US started to try to establish its control over Iraq, a primary goal of the US was to get rid of the Ba'ath Party. The US government put a man named Paul Bremer in charge of the occupation, and Bremer implemented a number of policies that the administration of George W. Bush had developed. First, he disbanded the entire Iraqi army, thereby putting almost 1 million men out of work. Second, he implemented a policy called de-Ba'athification, in which anyone who was a ranking member of the Ba'ath Party was removed from their jobs. So most officials in the civil service were members of the Ba'ath Party, and certainly any long-serving officials were. So within the first few weeks of the occupation, the US government had taken a number of steps that I would argue undermined its other goal, which was to create a smooth transition to a democratic system in Iraq. The US government had angered huge numbers of people by firing them from work, and it had also removed the only real political party in the country, the Ba'ath Party. What followed, and what has followed for the past 17 years, is a very fragmented political landscape with lots of different competing parties and an ongoing insurgency, often led by people who had been in the army and were fired from the army. This slide is showing you all the various political leaders of Iraq since 2004, since Bremer stepped back and handed over power to a transitional council. The thing I want you to take from this image of all these different people and their names and their dates is just how much political churn there's been in Iraq during the last 16 years. Even the final picture I have here, that guy has now stepped down, been replaced by somebody else, and there's ongoing tension at this very moment in Iraq. There is not a single authority able to exercise control over the state. And what's happened is different ministries are controlled by different parties are backed by different factions, different politicians have different militias that are backing them, in which they have some authority over, but not necessarily total authority over. In fact, just as often in the country, political power rests with the militias themselves, the organizations they represent, or the foreign governments that back those militias, including the United States, Iran, and so on. Now, for the last 15 minutes, I've been giving you a political history of Iraq, very rapidly, I think. What I want to do for the rest of this lecture is to talk to you about how everything I've been telling you can be understood in terms of patriarchy and therefore gender relations. Because what I've been talking to you about, whether it's the Hashemite dynasty, the military regimes of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, or the fractured politics of today. During all of these periods, what I'm really talking about is who has authority in society, who gets to have a say in shaping the society, and those type of questions cannot be disassociated from issues of gender and issues of patriarchy. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. In their purest form, all monarchies are patriarchies. They exist by appeal to traditional values, traditional structures, and they operate as though the entire country were a household run by a male patriarch. In a pure monarchy, the kings have total power. All business, all opportunities to involve yourself in society, in the marketplace, and all of that stems from the king. Now, in practice, things are quite different. And even in the late Ottoman Empire, there'd been a move to move away from, say, this patrimonial form of rule to a more legal, bureaucratic form of rule. Under the Young Turks in the early 1900s, there had been efforts to systematize the laws, bring back the Constitution, and all these types of things. During World War I, in fact, the Young Turk government had actually created a new law code that superseded religious laws that had previously been on the books. So no longer were subjects of the Ottoman Empire going to their local religious official to get married, to deal with contracts, to deal with inheritance. Now there was actually an official law that applied to everybody throughout the empire. However, by the time this law had been passed, the Arab-speaking lands of the Ottoman Empire had already been conquered by the British and French. So in the case of Iraq, while the Young Turks were creating these new sets of more rational, bureaucratic laws, under the British zone of occupation, the reverse was happening. As you can read in one of the readings you have to choose from this week, under British rule, there was actually an effort to devolve authority away from, say, the overall British administration or away from the pre-existing Ottoman rule, and devolve authority back to the local figures of the sheikhs, these local quasi-religious officials, landowners, but local officials on the ground. The British did this for two reasons. One, the British didn't feel that they had the power or the knowledge to run things at the local level. Two, they actually thought that this was how societies in the Middle East operated, that these sheikhs were the most important people in the society, and therefore it was best to have them run things. So, under the British in 1916, 1917, 1918, and onwards, the authority to settle disputes was rested with local officials. And so women, for example, were subject not to some rule that applied the same everywhere, but to rules created by their local officials in their towns, in their villages. Even women living in cities could be subject to the laws of their villages if their husband was from a village or they themselves were and they were not married to an urban dweller. So under the British, there was this reversal of rights away from a more universal sense of rights and citizenship to a more local one based on more traditional values. This continued into the 1920s and 1930s as well under the Hashemite dynasty, even as the British left and the Hashemite family became in charge of Iraq. They too relied on local strongmen, these local sheikhs, in order to give themselves legitimacy, because the Hashemite family was not from Iraq. They were from the Arabian Peninsula, from Mecca, Medina area, and they needed a way of asserting their authority, and they did this by appealing to this diversity of local leaders who the Hashemites could play off one another in order to assure that they, the Hashemites, were the only single group in the country of Iraq able to have national authority, since power was scattered between all these different local officials. But this is not the only story. Just like the Kemalists in Turkey, the Hashemites in Iraq were also trying to create a unified nation. And especially in urban areas, women had access to education. And there was an effort by Hashemite officials to create a national school system, a sense of national belonging, and part of this was to create a ideal Iraqi man, ideal Iraqi woman, and part of that was education. And so during the 20s and 30s, women increasingly were able to access education in the cities. Many of these elite women became involved in larger scale political organizations and movements and made demands on the monarchy to improve women's rights, especially by getting rid of laws that gave tribal sheikhs authority over women's lives. But until the revolution in 1958, there was not a great deal of success. A good example of this mobilization leading to success after 1958 is Naziha al-Dualimi. Now, she was a medical doctor and member of the Iraqi Communist Party. So during the 40s and 50s, she was active in arguing for more rights for women, and she was also active in arguing that the British should get out of Iraq. So she was involved in major protests in the late 40s against treaties between the Hashemite and the British government that allowed the British to keep a lot of troops in Iraq. And during the 50s, she continued to work with women's organizations. After 1958, she was brought into the Qasim government as a minister, the only woman and the only communist minister in the cabinet. And she was involved in crafting a new personal status law, which was one of the largest accomplishments of the Qasim regime. So what is a personal status law? Well, a personal status law is a law that regulates aspects of family life. So without a personal status law in Iraq, these type of things, marriage, inheritance, divorce, custody of children, all of that was decided by local officials, local sheikhs. Now, after 1959, the actual government of Iraq took authority for all of these things. Now, government judges would make decisions, and the rules would be specified in law, and they would apply to all citizens of Iraq. This was a huge change. No longer were people, whether they were Sunni, Shia, or any other religious group, no longer were they subject to local religious authorities. Now, they were citizens of the state with equal rights, no matter where they lived, no matter who they were. Among the provisions of the law was a limitation on polygamy. It could now only be done with a judge's consent, and that was not likely to come. There was also a limitation on child marriages. Now 18 years old was the age of marriage, 16 under some circumstances. Men could no longer divorce women arbitrarily. Women's testimony was equal to men's in court, and most controversially, women's inheritance was equal to men's. So this was a huge change. As you can imagine, though, by circumventing religious authorities, this new law created a lot of resistance in Iraqi society. Also, the fact that it was backed by people like Naziha, who had links with the Communist Party, also angered members of, say, the Shia and Sunni religious hierarchies, large landowners, other traditional authorities in Iraqi society. So there's a huge amount of resistance to this personal status law and a huge amount of resistance to Qasim, who was allowing people like Nazihat into his government and letting them form policy. This formed one of the reasons why he was kicked out of office in a coup in 1963. The coup leaders who removed Qasim were a mix of his fellow nationalist officers, Ba'ath Party members, and one of the few things they were able to do before they were kicked out by a coup, which was then kicked out by a coup, and so on and so forth, was that they amended the personal status law, making it no longer easy for women to claim half the inheritance, which I think shows you how important issues of women's status actually was to why regime changes happened at this point, right? Now, whether it was Qasim's government, the coup governments that followed him, or the Ba'ath Party government that came in 1968 and then stayed for many decades, the primary goal in this legislation was to have state control over society. The goal was to remove local strongmen, local religious figures, religious hierarchies, traditional authorities, and replace it with the authority of the state. Because the idea that all of these officers and their supporters had was that it was important to emphasize state authority in order to develop the country. Other sources of authority merely kept the country undeveloped and backwards. So the personal status law functioned both as a way of increasing women's rights from the perspective of feminist activists, but from the perspective of these military leaders, it often was simply a way of asserting their control over society. And so it was a double-edged sword. And we see this throughout the Ba'ath Party era, from 1968 onwards. The Ba'ath Party increased educational opportunities for women and tried to increase job opportunities for women as well. But it did this not particularly out of an interest in women as individuals, but as it had an interest in strengthening the state control over the society. So, for example, in 1978, the Ba'ath Party again amended this personal status law. It gave women 72 days of health care and paid leave when they had children. It made it easier for women to get inheritance again. It also made it much more difficult for women to be divorced arbitrarily, so it strengthened a lot of the provisions of the 1959 law. But all of these things were done by the Ba'ath Party in the interests of increasing the productive capacity of the state, getting more women into the workforce. Consequently, women's rights and women's status were subject to the fickle, changing whims of the Ba'ath Party leadership. Now, on this slide, you'll notice I have the dates of military rule as from 1958 until 2003, but I have an asterisk. And that's because after 1979, we're not really talking about military rule or Ba'ath Party rule so much as we're talking about Saddam Hussein's personalistic rule. A lot of scholars talk about this period under Saddam Hussein as the Tikriti Ba'ath rather than, say, the Iraqi Ba'ath. And they say this because Saddam Hussein was from the city of Tikrit and his tribe was from there. And even during the 70s, he'd been placing his tribal relations in key positions throughout the state, the party, and the security apparatus. Now, it wasn't that Iraq became a familial state only after Saddam Hussein came to power. The reason he had a position in the Ba'ath Party to begin with is because family relations, such as President al-Bakr, had been his relatives. So this familial element was already there, but it became stronger in the 1980s. In this picture, you see Saddam Hussein's family. Sitting next to him is his son-in-law and second cousin, who was in charge of the security apparatus. Standing behind him are his children, one of whom was in charge of militias during the 1990s, so informal institutions outside the party, outside the state, but loyal to Saddam directly via his family. So what you see is the state starts to be run more like a monarchy, right, as it had been during the Hashemite era, which means that, again, we're getting back to these ideas of patriarchy and the role of the father figure and the state functioning like a family. So this starts to happen again under Saddam Hussein. Also, only a year into Saddam's rule, Iraq and Iran went to war. And suddenly, this emphasis on, say, women in the workplace changed. And the image that the government began promoting was an image of masculinity defined by the soldier fighting on the front lines, and femininity of women raising children in order to indoctrinate them in proper Iraqi national values. When soldiers died, or when, for example, in 1987, a bomb fell on a school, killing lots of children, Saddam's state responded by a campaign to increase fertility. So suddenly the most important thing women could be doing was having more children. The fact that wartime mass conscription of men actually brought more women into the workplace created a lot of tension. And during these years, there was periodic calls by Saddam for women not to overstep their demands for rights and to remember that their primary role was as mothers and in the home. In the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, and even more so in the aftermath of the Gulf War, the Iraqi state was left so weak that it was unable to exert itself in society as it once had. In order to maintain his authority, Saddam began looking for new ways to bolster his authority. So primary among these was a renewed emphasis on traditional values and Islam. So this had two effects on women. The first was what some scholars call neo-tribalism. So just like the Hashemites had, Saddam also began devolving a lot of authority to local sheikhs. And these local figures were now the ones exercising control over people's daily lives, men and women's. The most dramatic example of this renewed appeal to tradition was probably the issue of honor killings. In 1990, the government briefly legalized honor killings. Now, honor killings are when a male member of a family kills a female member of his family, a sister, a cousin, something like this, because she's committed adultery or perhaps been raped. Anything that's considered to bring dishonor to the family. So he's killing her to protect the honor of the family. Prior to 1990, honor killings had been illegal, but judges were encouraged under the law to take into consideration the circumstances regarding the murder, because perhaps if it was reasonable, the sentence could be commuted. Now in 1990, even that went by the wayside. But briefly, there was protests and pushback, and the government backtracked. Still, this move signaled that the government was no longer interested in protecting women from that type of abuse. Moreover, in the coming years, one of Saddam's sons, Uday, even wrote an op-ed saying how honor killings were part of Iraq's tribal heritage. So again, we see here that the government is pointing to traditional values to give it a sense of legitimacy. Those values often come at the expense of women. Another way in which women suffered during the 1990s was the government's renewed emphasis on morality and religion. There was a number of faith campaigns and morality campaigns that encouraged people to read the Quran, dress more modestly, stop drinking alcohol. In fact, alcohol sales were banned in public in the mid-90s, as were nightclubs. Quranic verses were added to the flag in Saddam Hussein's own handwriting in order to create this link symbolically between Saddam, religion, and the state. But throughout all this, women were once again made into a symbol of this new morality. So women were the ones who had to dress differently now. Women were the ones who had to act differently in public. Women were the ones whom President Saddam would periodically say should quit their jobs in order to focus on home life. So the point I want to emphasize here is this contradiction. On the one hand, after the monarchy ended from 1958 until 2003, women's rights did increase under these different military regimes. Women's participation in the labor force went from around 2% in 1957, the year before the revolution, up to about 30% by 1990, and in some sectors of the economy even higher than that. Women had new rights. They had protections from divorces. They had financial rights. They had equal citizenship under the law to men. But, and here's the contradiction, these rights were part of a larger effort by these different regimes to supplant other forms of authority, male authority over the home, religious authority over the family, uh, landlord and sheikh's authority over their workers, over their peasants. These various regimes were seeking to assert their authority over more walks of life. And this helped liberate women from certain forms of domination, but subjected them to other forms of domination. Because, especially as we can see under Saddam Hussein's regime, the goals of the state and its leaders could change very quickly, and therefore women's rights in society could suddenly change very quickly. Of the two readings you have to choose from this week, one reading is about Iraq during the 1920s and 30s. The other reading is about Iraq during the more recent past 20 years. And my guess is most of you will read that article, and therefore I don't want to talk too much about the past 20 years because you'll be reading about it and we'll be discussing it in class one way or the other. So I just want to focus on two things when I talk about the role of the patriarchy and therefore women and gender and the state and women's rights and citizenship and democracy. I just want to focus on two things when I talk about these last 20 years. The first is enforced sectarianism. So after the American invasion and during the American occupation, U.S. officials understood Iraq to be a society divided into different sects, Sunni, Shia, and also linguistic groups like Kurds up in the north. And so U.S. officials tried to ensure that the Constitution, the political order that emerged out of their occupation, would be one that reflected Iraq's divides. The practical result of this has been a series of coalition governments in which prime ministers have to balance parties representing all the different competing sects and factions of sects. Women lose out in this. And one of the articles argues this. It points out that in these coalition cabinets, there's only so many seats for ministers, and those minister positions tend to go to the leaders of different parties, and the parties are male dominated. So women aren't getting into the cabinet. The same thing happens in the larger parliament. The party lists during elections put the men near the top because they want to ensure that those candidates get into the parliament. Women don't tend to get put high on these lists. So because the American created post-invasion order has given a preference to sects rather than, say, just the population at large, it's produced a political order in which sects are competing with one another and the population is not really being represented. The Constitution of Iraq mandates a 25% quota for women, and following the previous election, women make up 25% of the parliament. It's worth noting, of course, that in America, women only make up 23.7% of the Congress, so this is worth keeping in mind as well. In addition to sectarian balance taking precedence over issues like demographic representation in Iraqi governments, a second important aspect of the post-invasion occupation era has been what I'm calling loss of state capacity. After the U.S. invaded, it dissolved the Iraqi army, it fired tens of thousands of career bureaucrats, and geostrategically speaking, the U.S. presence and threat encouraged Syria and Iran to fund uprisings in Iraq that destabilized the security situation in the country. The wars Saddam started with Iran and with the U.S. over Kuwait, followed by the U.S.'s invasion, have utterly destroyed the capacity of the Iraqi state to exercise authority. In other words, even if the state wanted to take precedence over traditional authorities, over family authorities, over households. Even if the state wanted to sideline patriarchs, give women rights, it lacks the ability to do that. Even if the state wanted to provide security, it would have trouble doing that. Instead, security, to the extent that it exists in Iraq, has become the province of militias. So, what does this mean? What's been happening in Iraq the last 17 years? Well, I would argue to you that the most useful way to think about this is the way Denise Candioti describes it to us in her article, Bargaining with the Patriarchy. Because what she's arguing is that women and men are constantly in negotiation over, over rights and power. And what we see in Iraq is a situation where women have lost a great deal of bargaining power. When the state was competing with male heads of household, women could negotiate between the state and their male relations. No longer is that the case. With state capacity gone, women are being forced once again to bargain with the patriarchy close to them, and the terms are not in their favor. So to bring this lecture to a conclusion, let's go back to the beginning again and think for a second. Juliet Mitchell argued that patriarchy is the domination of men over women. Well, we've certainly seen that in this account of Iraqi history. We've seen male rulers of the state dictating to women how they should act. The way Joan Scott puts it, though, is a little different. She's not necessarily arguing that the goal of all these leaders we've looked at is to dominate women. Rather, what she might argue is that the goal of all these rulers is to rule, and the way they do that is by appealing to patriarchy. Under the Hashemites justified their rule by appealing to traditional forms of authority, by relying on local control, by relying on sheikhs, landowners, male heads of household. The Hashemites were able to justify their authority to rule as monarchs. Likewise, we saw under Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein played up his military prowess. Under Saddam, the Ba'ath Party presented an image of the masculine, militarized nation. Men were fighters, women should be in the home. By playing up these ideas of gender roles, Saddam justified his own rule. I already talked to you about Denise Candioti. I pointed out how current events in Iraq are an example of these gender pacts, these patrimonial bargains women have to do in order to survive. But everything I've been talking about could be thought about in terms of Candioti's ideas also. During the 1958 revolution, you had a moment where these new rulers, Qasim and the people who came after him, wanted to expand the authority of the state. They wanted to push aside traditional forms of authority. This gave women a sudden opportunity to renegotiate the terms of their bargain. And they did. They pushed for new personal status laws that gave them more rights. Unfortunately, it was a bargain, and it was subject to renegotiation as circumstances changed. And by the 70s, by the 80s, by the 90s, the situation had changed for women, and the terms were no longer as good. Finally, and more generally, I want to point to Yuval Davis and Atheist's way of thinking about this. Whereas they point out that we should look to these different ways that regimes create roles for women. And we've seen this especially under the Ba'ath Party, where women are forced to act as mothers, or under the Hashemites, where women were seen as representatives of the modern state, and so given education, at least in the cities. Again and again, I think we've seen examples where women are allowed to be participants, but not necessarily definers of the order that's being created. So I think each of these scholars has interesting ideas to offer and interesting ways we can think about what I've been talking about for the past hour. In class, I want to discuss more about how this relates to democracy, or if it relates to democracy, and I want to talk through some of the ideas I've shared with you this lecture. But for now, I'm just going to leave you with this study question to answer, and I look forward to talking about it with you all next week. Bye.
السنين المضى عشت بعتاب ورضا غنيت حب انقضى حب السنين المضى عشت بعتاب ورضا غنيت حب انقضى تاليها شفت العمر شمع بليالي الصبر تاليها شفت العمر شمع بليالي الصبر اتمنى لا تبتعد لا عيني لا تبتعد بشواطئ الهوى طيرين نمرح سوا يتغاوى بينا الهوى كنا بشواطئ الهوى طيرين نمرح سوا يتغاوى بينا الهوى بين النبض والقلب حبك حبيبي انكتب بين النبض والقلب حبك حبيبي انكتب يا عيني لا تبتعد لا عيني لا تبتعد احسب لي